Hello. We're going to be concluding the book of 1 Samuel. Really, it's not a conclusion at all because 1 and 2 Samuel originally were one book, I believe. It's one continuing history, as 1 and 2 Kings are one continuing history. I think it's very interesting now that we're coming down to the very tragic end of the complete transfer of power from King Saul, who's going to die in chapter 31, to David beginning in 2 Samuel. Now, chapter 30 is very interesting. It's kind of subtle in what it's doing, but it's showing the leadership of David and preparing him to be king, at least of Judah, until he will unite all of the tribes around him later on. So let's begin our study, if we could, at chapter 30. Then it happened when David and his men came to Ziklag. Now, as you know from our previous studies, David had been a favorite with the king of Gath, one of the 5 major Philistine city overlords. And the Gath had taken David and his men northward along the coastal plain called the Sheplah to the valley of Jezreel, where the 5 Philistines commanders, city kings, had gathered together against Saul's army. But the other Philistines were afraid of David, and David was sent home. It's about a 50 or 60 mile journey back south to the city of Ziklag. This is a city that the king of Gath had given to David. I think David kind of tricked him into this because he wanted to be away from the king's observation. For David was telling him that he was raiding Judah, which showed the king of Gath that David had become obnoxious and odious to the Jews. When in reality he was raiding these southern desert tribesmen like Amalek and others that were not raided to the Jewish people. So Ziklag was a small city, and we find that very common for these mercenary types to be given a small city like this. But David had taken all of his men with him. It was a strategic error, and he had left his city undefended. Now they came to Ziklag on the 3rd day. It's about how long it would take to get there. And the Amalekites had made a raid on the Negev. Now the Amalekites are the traditional enemies of the people of God. Back during the wilderness wandering period, this desert nomadic Arab tribe attacked the end of the Hebrew entourage, or the train, as they moved around the wilderness. And at the end, of course, was the sick and the old and the crippled, and that's where they took the spoils from Israel. Israel hated them for this. Really, we have here a contrast between the way David handled the Amalekites and the way Saul handled the Amalekites back in chapter 15. And as you remember, Saul not killing all of the Amalekites and sparing Agag is the reason that Saul was rejected personally from being king over Israel. Now Amalek was probably making a retaliatory raid on David, for we learn from chapter 27, verse 8, that David had already previously raided some of Amalek's tribesmen. Now they're a nomadic tribe, they don't live together, but they kind of kept in touch, I'm sure, and they knew that David had attacked some of theirs, and now they're going to attack David and his home base. Now when it says the Negev, this means the dry country. It's not like the Sahara Desert. It is like uninhabited pasture land. Now sometimes you see pictures of the hills of Judah, particularly maybe southern Judah down south of Beersheba. It looks like there's nothing there, but on closer look, there are little brown tufts of grass. And camels and goats and sheep can live on this, and this would be called, when you get even further south into less and less vegetation, it becomes the Negev, the south country. Little water, if any. And overthrown Ziklag and burned it with fire, so everything in his city was gone. And he took captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great, without killing anyone, and carried them off and went their way. This is amazing, without killing anyone. What this basically says is one of two things. This is with either divine protection some way for the families of David and his men, or, what's more probable, David did not leave one fighting man, one soldier, one person old enough to defend the city, and therefore there was no possibility of defense, and they had to capitulate. Now, without killing anyone, what's this for? Well, they're going to turn these people into slaves. They're going to sell them for slaves. That's what they're going to do. That's when they took them alive. And when David and his men came to the city, behold, it was burned with fire, and their wives, their sons, and their daughters had been taken captive. And David and the people with him lifted up their voices and wept until there was no strength in them to weep. Now, we know from the Old Testament, even modern Jews to some extent, that they were extremely emotional at the sense of loss, a funeral, or that kind of thing. These men had no hang-ups in expressing their emotions rather fervently. And so it was wailing time, and these men wailed and they were exhausted. And the transfer of bitterness came from their loss onto David, who didn't leave a bodyguard at home. Matter of fact, it even mentions down here in verse 6, the people talked of stoning him, much like what happened to Moses in Exodus 17:4. A transference of anger from God to Moses. Here, a transfer of anger from the Amalekites to David. For all the people were embittered, each one because his sons and daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. Oh, what a wonderful phrase that is. In the midst of problems and difficulty and crisis, in that dark night of the soul, where did David draw strength from? Did he focus on his failure of strategy? Did he focus on what he had lost? No. He focused on the Lord his God and drew strength from that. He knew that God had a plan for his life. He knew that God was with him. He knew that God had anointed him through Samuel. He knew that goodness and mercy would follow him all the days of his life. There was a brief setback, but God was in control. There was a purpose in this. And what we're going to see is it's really going to help David prove to Judah that he wasn't fighting Saul, but that he was fighting Israel's traditional enemies. He was the one winning victories over the Amalekites, not Saul, who was going to suffer defeat at the hands of the Philistines, and David had no part in it. And I think this chapter sets the stage for that. After drawing strength from the Lord, we see that David said to Abiathar the priest. Now, Abiathar, of course, is of the lineage of Eli when the tabernacle was at Shiloh. During David's time, there's going to be two priests, as you later know, when David's anointed. There will be Zadok and Abiathar. Abiathar will side with one of David's rebellious sons and be exiled by Solomon to the city of Anathoth, about 3 miles from Jerusalem. And this will be, the prophet Jeremiah will come from this line. But right now, he is the legitimate high priest. He has been alienated from Saul by the massacre of the priest at Nob, who helped David. And now here's the only one left, and he is the official legitimate priest, the son of Ahimelech. Bring me the ephod. Now, the ephod, there are several ways the ephod is used in the Old Testament. Some think it was an idol of some kind, and there are some scriptures that obviously can mean that. But here it's obviously like some kind of a vest that the high priest wore, to which the breastplate was attached, the 12 stones, one for each of the tribe of Israel. And behind that breastplate was a pocket, which held the Urim and the Thummim, which was some way of knowing God's will by either casting stones or rocks or drawing a black or white stone, some way to say yes or no that God revealed his will. And so David asked the high priest to seek the Lord, and you might want to see this Urim and Thummim back in chapter 2, verse 28. And David inquired of the Lord, saying, Shall I pursue this band? Shall I overtake them? Now notice my New American Standard says in verse 8, and he said to him, and the word he is a capital H. The Committee on Translation assumed this is God speaking. But I really think it's probably Abimelech speaking for, Abiathar speaking for God. And he said to him, Pursue, and you shall surely overtake them, and you shall surely rescue. And my has the word all in italics. That's the implication here, though it's not in the text. And we're going to find in verses, 17 through 20, that everyone was rescued. I mean, it's almost like the entire Amalekites, except for 400 cavalry that got away. All the rest are killed. All the spoils are retrieved. It's a complete and perfect victory, except for the 400 cavalry that got away on camels. So David went, he and his 600 men who were with him, and they came to the brook Besor. We're not sure exactly where Besor is. There's many theories. We're not sure. It's somewhere in the south. And those left, where those left behind remained. Now, there seems to be about 200 men that were so exhausted from the journey of coming all the way from up in the valley of Jezreel, traveling 3 days to get home, the trauma of crying all night over their family, then a forced march south to catch up with these people. Apparently some were just too old or too tired or sick or what, and 200 of them stayed here with David's provisions, and they're going to leave 200 here. Verse 11. Now they found an Egyptian in the field and brought him to David and gave him bread, and he ate, and they provided him water to drink. Now the next few verses talk about how they fed him. Apparently he had been sick and had been left to die by the Amalekites. He apparently was a slave that had been bought earlier and taken probably on some raid just like this into Egypt. And the man was asked questions, and he made a deal and said, I'll help you and take you to the Amalekites if you promise not to hurt me or give me back to them. And David, of course, said, that's true. David, I'm sure, believed this was a divine act to show him where these desert marauding bands had gone. They couldn't search the whole desert. I'm sure the wind, as it blew across for 3 days, had erased the tracks of these large camel group. And so David was at the mercy here of God showing him. David believed that God was going to show him, and here God came through. As David was being led by God, Saul was not being led by God. There's the contrast again. And David asked whom he serves, and he says, an Amalekite. I was sick 3 days ago. They just left me here. You show something of the sign of mercy and compassion these folks had. They made a raid on the Negev. Now this Cherethites, well, we've wondered about that some. They're only mentioned a couple of times in the Bible. Some think they may be a kind of a spelling that shows they're from the island of Crete. And that is very possible. For the Philistines, I believe, are from the Aegean Islands. They were only uncircumcised group in Canaan. They kind of took on the Canaanite culture instead of importing their own. But every time this other group is mentioned, it's always in connection with the Philistines. You might want to see Ezekiel chapter 25, verse 16, and Zephaniah chapter 2, verse 5. So I believe they probably are people from the Aegean Islands. Now when it says, and on the Negev of Caleb, we learn from Judges chapter 1, verse 20, that Caleb was given the city of Hebron, and it is probably this area around Hebron that's being referred to as the area of Caleb. Now, notice if you would where it says, and we burned Ziklag with fire. And David said to him, will you bring me down to this band? And the man made a deal with him. Now, verse 16. And when he had brought him down, behold, they were spread over the land, eating and drinking and dancing, because of all the great spoil they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. Well, they were in a party mood. Apparently they were somewhat inebriated, intoxicated. They were getting ready to enjoy the spoils, divide them up, see exactly what they've had. And so they were really in a very festive mood and very vulnerable to attack. And David slaughtered them from twilight until the evening of the next day. Now it's somewhat difficult to ascertain exactly what the term twilight means. It can mean dusk or dawn. In context, it seems to mean dawn here, meaning he took all day long from dawn till morning. I'm not exactly sure. It may have been the evening that he attacked them, for I'm sure that there'd be problems with the women being abused that evening, and maybe David would attack in the evening instead of waiting for the dawn, but we're just not sure from this Hebrew word. Not a man of them escaped, except the 400 young men who rode on camels and fled. This is a very detailed description, is it not? 400 men. That was a force as big as David. They were a stronger force because they were cavalry on camels, and yet they fled in fear. So David recovered all the Amalekites had taken. He rescued his 2 wives, and none of theirs was missing, whether small or great, sons or daughters, spoil, or anything they had taken for themselves. We see the complete victory of David here over the Amalekites, and it's summarized in verses 17 through 20. Now, part of the livestock, the sheep, is going to be uniquely given to David. We know from some of the other annals that the captain of these marauding mercenaries usually got 1/4 of the spoil, and David chose this livestock because he's going to give it as a gift to some of the surrounding towns of Judah. Some of them had been hurt by this Amalekite raid, and others as a gesture of friendship for the times they had helped David. And David came to the 200 men who were too exhausted to follow David, and who had been left at the brook Besor, and they went out to meet David, to meet the people who were with him, and David approached the people and greeted them. Then all the wicked and worthless men among those who went with David answered. Now, it's obvious that David had a ragamuffin group with him. These are the malcontents of Israel that came and joined David. Of course, there's some rough, burnt-over stumps here. They didn't want to share nothing. But the leadership of David is seen clearly in how he handles these men in verses 21 through 25. He wants to share the spoil with these 200 that stayed behind. That was what was fair, David said, and that's what David was going to do. It even became a tradition to this very day. You might want to see verse 25. This shows how traditions in Israel started, how laws developed. Although there's much in common between Israeli law and other Mesopotamian cultures, here is example that the king instituted this law, and it was something that David did, and it became a law to that day. Verse 25 to this day shows that an editor has been involved in what we know as the historical books. It was written sometime after this event happened. The Jews believe that Ezra edited the whole Old Testament. Others believe that Jeremiah or one of the priests did that. Now, in verse 26 through 31, again, the leadership of David can be seen clearly. When David came to Ziklag, he sent some of the spoil to the elders of Judah. Now, it's especially those who had helped them in times when they were running from Saul. There is a list of cities here. I think it's interesting that the list, some of them we don't know where they are. The city of Bethel in verse 27 is obviously not the city of Bethel, about 12 miles north of Jerusalem, but some city in the area of Judah. Matter of fact, we think it's mentioned in 1 Chronicles chapter 4, verse 30, a different Bethel. Now, he tried to pay these people back. It was his way of staying on their good side. It was his way of showing them what he had been doing while the Philistines had been attacking Judah. And really, it was kind of a payback for all they had done for him and a preparation for David being king over Judah as soon after Saul's death. Now, notice it says, and those in Hebron to all the places where David himself and his men were accustomed to go. I want to mention to you that where it mentions here the gift to you from the spoils of the enemies of the Lord, this is a catchword. The enemies of the Lord be Amalek. Saul was supposed to take care of the enemies of the Lord. That was his job. Here David is taking care of the king's responsibility by taking care of the enemies of Israel. Another example of the transfer of power and the responsibilities being passed from Saul to David. Now in chapter 31 we have this very brief account. It's surprising. This closes out Saul's life, and the military conquest that's going on in the north between the Philistines and Saul is covered in such a few verses, while this seemingly minor skirmish to the south involving David covers a whole detailed chapter. Well, that's characteristic of Hebrew literature. It focuses on that one or that nation or that event that means most to the unfolding of God's plan for the people of God. Now, the Philistines were fighting against Israel. And the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. Now, Mount Gilboa is up to the north in the valley of Jezreel. It was very foolish for Saul to fight the Philistines in the valley of Jezreel because they had chariots. This low land was their kind of territory. I'm not sure if Saul got tricked into it or an act of desperation because they were trying to cut the tribes in half, apparently. I'm not exactly sure why, but the fact that Saul attacked this larger Philistine army in the plains shows his desperation or foolishness at this point. And of course the Israeli army lost bad. And the Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines killed, and here we list 3 of his sons. Now we know from later that Ishbosheth, one of his sons, is not killed, for he'll be anointed king in a Transjordan area by Abner. But these 3 of them are killed here with Saul. This kind of fulfills the prophecy of the witch of Endor we looked at earlier. And the battle went heavily against Saul, and the archers hit him. Now, archers became typical weapons in battle after the chariots became the dominant source of power in the ancient Near East. Hand-to-hand combat with a chariot was almost out, and so you had to have a long-range weapon like an archer or a javelin thrower to be able to hit these chariots before they could run over you. One of these archers hit him, and he was badly wounded. How often this happens, an archer hits somebody. It may seem random to the archer, but it's how God is going to take several lives in the Old Testament. And Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and pierce me through, lest the uncircumcised," the Philistines are the only uncircumcised group we know. We think that's a good sign that they were from the Aegean Islands. It's a theory. They invaded Egypt, but were repulsed by Egypt, and therefore were settled on the southwest corner of Canaan, which later took their name. Palestine is a kind of a corruption of the term Philistine, and we believe they were Greek people and therefore uncircumcised. Now he was kind of afraid of what would happen to him, of what the Philistines did to Samson. Put his eyes out, forced him to do this and that, made a fool of him. Saul did not want that to happen. He knew he was a traditional enemy of them, and they would make great sport of him. But the armor-bearer would not, because he was greatly afraid. I think the young man was afraid to kill God's king. The same way David was afraid to kill God's anointed, this young man, apparently for religious reasons, though it's not spelled out here. It may have been other reasons, we're not sure, but possibly it's the same fear that David had. Now, and then after Saul killed himself, the armor-bearer killed himself. So it's a double suicide. There are several suicides mentioned in the Bible. There are some other ones. I'll give you the places where they're mentioned. 2 Samuel 17:23, one of David's counselors that went with one of David's rebellious sons killed himself. 1 Kings 16:18, and of course Judas in Matthew 27:5. And I want to say a word here about suicide. I think it's become such a major problem in our day. I do a lot of question and answers with young people, especially high school, college young people. I'm amazed at how much the question of suicide comes up in groups when it's anonymous questions. I want to say to you that suicide here is not seemingly condemned. There's no religious connotation put to it. It's not true that suicide means that you can't be saved. If we're saved, it's a free act of grace through Jesus Christ, and then something we do, even as tragic as take our own life, if it's a gift, it can't be taken for us for what we do, I think. It is, I think, certainly a tragedy. It's the ultimate cop-out. It's lack of faith in God. It's not desirable, but it's not something that would condemn someone to an eternal separation from God. It's a tragedy, and we don't have many examples of it in the Bible, but here are two right together. Notice, if you would, in verse 7 then. By the way, this kind of fulfilled Samuel's prediction of chapter 28, verse 19, and I think you probably ought to see that. By the way, in 1 Chronicles 10:6, it says all of Saul's sons died, and here we know that there was at least one that was not killed. But in a summary sense, all of Saul's sons were pretty much stopped here. Saul's power was broken, is what it's trying to say. And when the men of Israel, who were on the other side of the valley, of course they were across the other side of the valley of Jezreel, saw what happened, with those who were beyond the Jordan River saw the men of Israel had fled. Now, in 1 Chronicles 10:7, which is a parallel to this, it doesn't mention this on the other side of Jordan. There's two possibilities. Usually when we say the other side of Jordan, it means people on the eastern bank. We call it the Trans-Jordan area, Bashan, Gilead, the tribal allocation of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh. Sometimes it can mean the western bank, which we would call the Promised Land. Here we're not exactly sure. Because Chronicles leaves it out, it seems to imply the Trans-Jordan area was not invaded by Philistines, because that's where Ishbosheth is later going to be anointed king very quickly by Saul's military commander Abner. So I would say what we have here is the fact that they left the cities in the Jezreel area and let the Philistines take over that. It's a plain, their chariots were powerful, and they deserted those when they saw the battle went against them. And it came about the next day, the Philistines came to strip the slain, take their armor, take their swords. They found Saul on Mount Gilboa. They cut off his head, kind of what David did to Goliath in chapter 17:5 to humiliate him, to show the victory. They did to Saul. They stripped off his weapons and sent them throughout the land of the Philistines to carry the good news to the house of their idols. Their idols didn't know what had happened because they're just made with human hands. They didn't have divine knowledge or omnipresence to know. They had to be shown, which is a sample of the ridiculousness of idolatry. And they put his weapons in the temple of Ashtoreth. We learn from Herodotus that one of the oldest temples of the love goddess, called Venus by Herodotus, but Ashtoreth is the Canaanite counterpart of that. She was the war goddess and the consort of Baal, or the sister of Baal. We're not sure, depending on the different documents you read. But whatever, it seems the weapons were put there, much as David had put Goliath's weapons in the tabernacle at Nob. And so it's a kind of a way of saying that Dagon or Ashtoreth had done this. Now we learn from another passage, 1 Chronicles 10:10, that he put Saul's head in the temple of Dagon, which is the chief god of the Philistines. We learned during the Judges period. We also believe it was much like Baal, a fertility god from Mesopotamia. So this seems to fit. The male got the head, the female got the weapons. And they fastened his body to the wall of Bashan. We learn from Deuteronomy 21:23 that to be unburied was a curse from God, and they saw this as the ultimate humiliation. Now the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead. Now Saul had helped them back in 1 Samuel chapter 11 when they had been invaded by the Ammonites. And these cities did not forget. They came all night in a forced march, took down the bodies of Saul and his sons, took them back to the city, and buried them. Now this word, and they burned them there, in verse 12. This is omitted in the parallel of 1 Chronicles chapter 10, verse 12. We learn from further etymological study this word can mean burnt incense with. Okay? Now some think this is not cremation, which is only used in the Old Testament very rarely, and only then as a sign of ultimate kind of shame and criticism of someone. Some say they burned them because they had no head. Others say they burnt incense because it mentions the bones in verse 13. They buried the bones, and so they didn't burn them completely in total cremation. So we must admit here we just don't know. I really think that what this is, it could mean anoint or burn incense to, and that probably is because of the odiousness of cremation to the Jews. That probably is what happens here. Later, these same bones are going to be dug up and reburied in the family grave of Saul. We see that in 2 Samuel chapter 21, verse 11 through 14. And they buried them under the tamarisk tree. These special trees were signs of the presence of underground water. They became very special. Deborah sat under a tree. Saul sat under a tree. And maybe this was a site that Saul had been to and visited in memory of him. They buried him under this special tree and then fasted for 7 days, the sign of mourning. They loved the man who helped them. They were loyal to him. And so I think it's a beautiful example of that. Well, this is the end of 1 Samuel. We're going to pick up in 2 Samuel with the ministry and reign of David. And I've enjoyed being with you. God bless you.